Thank you. Welcome today to another in a series of Clinton School programs. My name is Skip Rutherford, the Dean of the school. I would like you for a minute just to take your program, look on the back, a couple of blanks to fill in. On the program for Thursday, September 13th, Chad Beecher, that time is going to be 6 p.m. And on the program for Thursday, September 27th, Michael Duffy in the book, The Preacher and the Presidents, is going to be at noon on the 27th. But if you'll look at the schedule, it's a quite extensive September schedule. Let me first thank all of the volunteers and the staff who helped us and have been helping us throughout this series, and particularly today. We literally could not run this school and could not run these programs without our volunteers and our staff, and I'm grateful. I also would invite everyone to please turn your cell phones off, turn your beepers off, turn your Blackberries off, don't text message, so that we can move with the program. We're extremely honored today to have one of the preeminent American citizens in our midst. John Sweeney was elected to a fourth term as president of the AFL-CIO in 2005. In 2000, he was elected president of the Trade Union Advisory Committee, an international organization that represents over 70 million workers and includes over 55 national trade union centers in 29 countries. Having lunch with him just a moment ago, he's been a part of the labor union movement for over 50 years. And he got involved in the labor movement through the work of his parents as a young boy. So this has been a part of his fiber and his fabric his entire life. In 1996, he authored America Needs a Raise, Fighting for Economic Security and Social Justice. He co-authored Solutions for the New Workforce and co-edited Family and Work, Bridging the Gap. He's a graduate of Ona College in New York, the degree in economics. He holds honorary degrees from Oberlin College, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, University of Baltimore, Catholic University Law School, and the University of Toledo's College of Law. Clearly, when one talks about the influence of workers' rights, the influence of labor movement in American politics, and particularly as we look toward the 2008 elections, probably the single most influential and powerful person in that regard is our speaker today. Ladies and gentlemen, the president of the AFL-CIO, John Sweeney.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Dean Rutherford, for the very kind introduction. And I'm happy to be invited here today to spend some time with all of you. I thank the Dean for guiding the work of the Clinton School of Public Service, which is such a great living tribute to Bill Clinton, a great president. I want to recognize the president of the Arkansas AFL-CIO Federation, Alan Hughes, who is with us. And some of the other labor representatives who are here, who work together with our local unions and do some great work for working families here in Arkansas. I'm happy to see many students and members of the faculty, local community leaders who have joined us. I want to recognize the AFL-CIO organizing director who was with me, Stuart Akoff. Stuart's father is a retired Baptist minister and who lives down the road from here a little bit, but Stuart has been working for working families all of his life. And his father, who was an outstanding Baptist minister, if he gave Stuart any good quality, he gave him the quality of preaching. Stuart preaches very well. And I'll introduce him after I finish for just a quick word on some of our programs. He happens to be one of the most passionate and effective speakers that we have. And he is a great organizing director and a real warrior when it comes to working people and protecting their freedom to join and to form unions. My remarks today are based on the tragedy that America isn't working very well for working Americans. I'll talk first a little bit about myself and the leadership of the American Union movement, and then about the situation of workers and their families, and what we must do about it, and finally, what happens if we don't. As I was telling the dean earlier, I am from New York City, as you, I think, know. Grew up in the Bronx. My parents were Irish immigrants. My father was a city bus driver. My mother was a domestic worker. We had a very happy home. Three things were paramount: family, faith, and my father's union. I knew from the beginning that the difference between my father's job and my mother's job was that my father had a union, and a union that helped him to achieve a decent standard of living. I knew that my mother didn't have a union as a domestic worker and was subject to the whims of the people she worked for. I went to union meetings from the earliest days. When I was in the 8th grade, I remember going to union meetings. I saw them when they were considering contract demands, when they were considering strikes, and when they were endorsing political campaigns. I went to Catholic schools in New York. I had a great awareness from my education of social justice and faith and how important it was. And I learned to focus on how human beings were treated and how they should be treated with decency and sharing with others. When I got out of college, I had worked my way through college. When I got out of college with my degree in economics, I tried to get a full-time job with one of the unions. I was a member of a couple of different unions from my college jobs. So I couldn't get a job at first, and I took a job at IBM. I had a degree in economics. And after I was working for IBM almost a year, I got a request to go for an interview with the ILGWU, which was the Ladies Garment Workers Union, which is now merged with other needle trade unions, and it's known as Unite. But I was making $90 a week at IBM. I took a pay cut to $60 a week to work for the union. I was so anxious to be in the labor movement, and I was still single, so I was able to do that. And it was one of the best decisions that I have ever made. 3 years later, I went to work for SEIU, which was one of the unions I was a member of, and worked in a local union in New York City that represented maintenance workers. And after 5 years there, I ran for office in the local, executive assistant to the president, and then rose up through other offices as they became available. And in 1976, I ran for president of the local, and this was a local of 50,000 members, and I was successful in that campaign. And during the 5 years that I was president, I had 2 citywide strikes of these maintenance workers, large strikes, approximately 30,000 workers in each of them. And one of the rare things that happened was our demands from the real estate operators in New York were so justified that the New York Times did an editorial urging the real estate industry to support the workers' demands, and the strike was settled 2 days later. It was a great experience. I later ran for president of the Service Employees International Union in 1980. It was a union of 600,000 members, and when I left there to go to the AFL-CIO, we had 1,200,000 members. And in 1995, I ran for president of the AFL-CIO. And that leads me to just saying a word about the leadership of the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO has had just a few great leaders who served for long periods of time, and each one faced difficult but very different crises. George Sweeney presided during the post-war boom and the rebuilding of Germany and Japan. He led during cycles of inflation and recession, the tumult of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. He was succeeded by Lane Kirkland during the rise of conservatism, deregulation, privatization, globalization, aggressive deunionization, and he was deeply involved with international affairs and especially very active in the Polish activities and the development and strength of Solidarność and the transition that took place in Poland. Tom Donahue had been Secretary-Treasurer under Lane Kirkland and served as president for just a few months. In 1995, Donahue and I competed for president. It was the first contested race in the AFL, in the history of the AFL-CIO. I was elected with a mandate to put a greater focus on the decline in living standards and the demise of the middle class, and to put new energy into fighting the policies behind the decline. Meantime, the attacks on working people and their power from the Bush administration have gotten worse than ever. Probably the most anti-union, anti-worker administration in my lifetime. I have served over a decade that has been the worst in memory in terms of hits on working families. But today there is a real reawakening about these issues, and I believe we are poised to change. Over the past 30 years, the situation of working families has degenerated, and it has mirrored the decline in union membership. Real wages have been going down steadily since 1973, forcing more and more family members into the workforce for more hours, especially more women. High-wage, full-benefit jobs replaced by low-wage, no-benefit jobs. There are many reasons, but a big cause is globalization, with rules and terms that favor corporations but do nothing about workers, and by a shift in political power to corporations and a shift to control of government to conservative forces. The conservative revolution. In the last 30 years, we've had 22 years of conservative government in Washington, and the result has been more than shift in power. It has been a shift in wealth. Our wage and wealth gap is the widest in history. CEOs making 400 times more than the average workers. Now 47 million Americans with no health insurance. Middle class is disappearing. Personal debt at an all-time high. Inequality threatens our entire economy because 70% of economic activity is consumer-driven. I want to talk today about 4 huge problems that hang over everything, and we have to solve them if if we're going to make America work for working people. And they are the loss of jobs to unfair trade, the inequality gap and the destruction of the middle class, health care, and the routine, brutal violation of workers' basic freedom to join and form unions and bargain for a better life. First, let me say a word about loss of good jobs to trade. Trade is so important to our country, and trade is so important to our economy, but it has to be a fair trade. It's a reality show when you look about what you've seen in other countries. We know that globalization is here to stay, but it doesn't have to be called survivor. It doesn't work right if corporations are free to pillage the world for cheaper and cheaper labor, slave labor, child labor. You look at the devastating levels of pollution and the routine violations of workers' rights in China. That country is artificially depressing the cost of its products by human rights practices that are immoral and unacceptable under the core labor standards of the ILO, and by environmental practices that are globally unsustainable. And China is manipulating its currency on top of it. We need new global rules to prevent that. It affects us all when a major economy pulls down standards, and we need to use the enormous bargaining power of U.S. trade to prevent that. What we've asked for is a level playing field. Our workers can compete with anyone in the world if the field is level. We need basic standards, ILO standards, of worker protection and environmental protection and public health protection. We had to develop new national rules when commerce became national. Now we have to develop new rules for global commerce. And we have to stop giving tax breaks to corporations that offshore and outsource. The incentive in our system is all wrong. Second problem, the inequality gap. There's no question that we have never had such a sustained period in history when the wealthy amassed more and more power while low and middle income workers lost power. It's affecting middle income workers in the heartland and workers at the lowest end of the economic scale. The treatment of largely invisible workers, many of them immigrants, is deplorable. All sorts of things are needed. We have to change the culture that allows corporations to exploit workers with the least power here. We have to stop destroying vital public services to give tax breaks to the rich. We have to raise the minimum wage again, not every 10 years. We have to restore regulations that prevent abuses. Pay as much attention to unemployment as inflation. Invest more in education and training. The third problem, health care. And it's appropriate that we talk about health care at this beautiful library. No one tried harder to change the health care system in our country than the President and the First Lady. They did an amazing job, but we didn't have the political will to really reform health care. And today, we just learned last week that there are now 47 million Americans without health care. That was 35 million when President Clinton was in office. This issue affects everybody. Rising costs are squeezing families and strangling companies. Drug companies and insurance companies are getting fatter, taking bigger and bigger slices out of workers' paychecks. Savings of our seniors are being whittled. It's making our companies who do provide good health care uncompetitive. Our trading partners are all from countries where the burden of health care is shared. Costs are controlled. Quality is high. We need to construct a uniquely American system by building on what works here in our own country and add in the best from the countries around the world which the American people would want to have included. In America, nobody should have to go without health care. We need comprehensive national reform, and we need it now. And the final problem is the freedom of workers to form and join unions. Unions are the best ticket into the middle class. Union members make 30% more money. Union members are much more likely to have pensions and health care. Unions raise standards for everybody else, and unions are the vehicle through which working people organize for political change. What we're seeing is that when you lose the ability to bargain for better wages and benefits, it affects the other three big problems that I just raised. You can't hold good jobs, inequality grows, healthcare declines. If we restore the ability of workers to form unions, we can take on the first three problems. The labor movement needs to be able to do what we do best: hold up workers' wages to the highest level possible, protect the working poor, give workers a voice, keep the political pendulum from swinging too far away from working families and the middle class, and too far towards the wealthy and the big corporations. I believe a stronger labor movement will make our country stronger, and we need everybody's help to make it happen. More than 60 million workers say they would join a union in a flash, but they're not going to sacrifice their jobs to do it. Thousands a year are fired for union organizing. The average has been, over the past several years, 25,000 workers a year who have lost their jobs because they tried to organize or form a union. We need to pass a piece of legislation called the Employee Free Choice Act to make it easier for workers to form unions and harder for employers to break the law and blow up organizing campaigns and harass and intimidate workers. A strong labor movement is the key to challenging all of these problems. These are huge problems. They are complicated and interrelated, and they span our entire nation. In fact, they are global. As important as it is for individuals to get involved and to speak out, individually, they cannot solve these problems. These are problems that have to be solved collectively, and a strong trade union movement is essential to solving them. We have to lead a movement for the common good, for the health and welfare of the many, and not just the few. And that's the only way we're going to solve our problems, by working together, business, government, and labor, all together. What happens if we don't make America work for working families? The result is that we all go down. A sinking ship sucks everyone inside. Let me tell you a little bit about what the AFL-CIO is doing about all this. We just launched the biggest healthcare campaign in our history, putting the force of our 10 million members and 3 million retirees behind winning healthcare for all by 2009. We're determined to dominate at the polls and elect progressive members of Congress, as we did last November, who will help us pass legislation like the Employee Free Choice Act to restore workers' freedom to join and form unions and bargain for a better life. We're engaging public policy to reverse our jobs crisis and to close the wage and wealth gap. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask Stuart Acuff to say a word, and he'll tell you that if you will give him an opportunity to explain how we won the Employee Free Choice Act in the House of Representatives earlier this year and got a majority of votes in the Senate, but not enough to stop a filibuster or overcome a presidential veto. Here in Arkansas, Senator David Pryor and Senator Blanche Lincoln voted on the side of workers. But they and all senators need to understand what's happening to workers when they try to win more bargaining power. So I ask you to help us spread that word. We're working with groups and communities at all levels. We're taking the lead in New Orleans by pumping in billions of dollars for housing and manufacturing and job training. We're working with low-wage workers to give them a hand up. We're working with farm workers across the country, and especially in Immokalee, Florida, home health and domestic workers across the country, immigrant workers, temporary day laborers, helping them gain full rights and protections that other workers have. What happens if we don't succeed? Incomes will continue to slide, more and more working power, more and more working poor. We'll have to rely on government service, emergency room medical care. Poverty will go up, tax revenues will go down, schools, bridges, and highways will be more neglected. Consumer confidence will keep eroding. People will lose more hope. Whole communities will deteriorate. Only gated communities will thrive, along with the very wealthy. Our country will become a plutocracy where whoever has the money makes the decisions, where only the wealthy candidate for elected office will win, where the rich and the powerful are secure, and the rest of us will have to fend for ourselves. The individual responsibility that President Bush talks about. I don't want to live in that kind of America, and I don't want my children and my grandchildren to have to live in that kind of America. And that's why the working families of our country and our unions are going to work harder than ever over the next 14 months to elect a new Congress that cares more about people than the corporate agenda, and a president who will lead us upward towards a high-road economy and a more inclusive democracy. Thank you all for this opportunity. Let me just ask Stuart Acuff to say a couple of words about this Employee Free Choice Act. And Stuart is the organizing director of the AFL-CIO and a great preacher.
Thank you, President Sweeney. I'll be very brief. It's good to be home again. As President Sweeney said, my father lives over there in Hot Springs, and all of my family is from West Tennessee and Arkansas, so it's really good to be home again. Thanks to all of you for coming out. Very quickly, we simply cannot restore, strengthen, and expand the American middle class, which is under assault and being squeezed every day, without restoring the freedom of average American workers to form unions and bargain collectively, bargain their way into the middle class, as millions of Americans did after World War II, when American workers first got the right to organize and form unions and bargain collectively. In that period, from the end of World War II through the 50s, the modern American labor movement was created, mostly in major manufacturing. But two other things were created as well. One was the American middle class, and we became the first country in the history of the world where if you worked by the hardness of your hand, the strength of your back, and the sweat of your brow, you could aspire to raise your kids in the comfort and decency of the middle class. The second thing was a thing we call the American dream. Both of those ideas are under assault in America today because workers have lost the freedom to form unions and bargain collectively. The assault on workers when they try to form a union in America's workplaces today is epidemic. President Sweeney said more than 20,000 workers over the last 15 years, every year, assaulted for trying to form a union. Average, in 90% of the times when American employers are faced with an organizing campaign, they hire anti-union consultants and attorneys to frustrate the will of the workers. 50% they threaten to close the facility, 30% of the time, 25 to 30% of the time, they fire the worker union leaders. And we cannot sustain the kind of society that we have as long as workers are prevented and assaulted and threatened their livelihood when they try to form a union. And so, friends and neighbors, we are threatened to be the first generation in the history of this country who leave our kids and our grandkids less than what was left to us. Less opportunity, less justice, more avarice, less compassion, more greed, and a meaner country. That is what is at stake. And that is why we have to pass the Employee Free Choice Act to give workers the right to form unions again. We've had a multi-year national grassroots campaign and demand that started in 2003, led by people like President Allen Hughes here in Arkansas, to pass this legislation. Last March 1, it came out of the House, 241 for it and 185 against it. Went to the Senate. We got a majority vote on a filibustered by the Republicans, 51 to 48. We have no greater priority, linked with trade, linked with national universal health care and the Employee Free Choice Act in the next 2 years. But it will take all of us, not just the labor movement, all people of goodwill, all people who believe that the economy should work for all of us and not just the few. So I call on you and I ask you, as you talk to Senator Pryor and Senator Lincoln, thank them for their support, but encourage their continued support. Thank you, Arkansans. Thank you, fellow Southerners. It's great to be with you. And President Sweeney, I think we'll take some questions.
We do have some time for some questions. Please raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Where's the questionnaire?
Bob, behind you.
Hi, Mr. Sweeney. My name is Sarah Himmelfarb, and I'm a student here in Class 3. I was also a member of the United Federation of Teachers in New York City when I taught in the Bronx. My question to you is, what advice would you have for future political leaders for working effectively with strong unions?
Would you repeat the question, please?
What advice would you have for future political leaders to work effectively with strong unions?
I think that that politicians have to understand the value of representing workers, and I think that workers have been showing a greater interest in politics because they realize that in order to achieve legislation that will address their priorities and their issues, they have to elect the right people to office. And I think that workers have to hold politicians accountable on their issues. And I would urge anyone pursuing a political career to really listen to workers and listen to their issues and their priorities. We held a candidates forum for the presidential in Chicago the first week of August, and 17,000 workers turned out at Soldiers Field to hear the candidates and to try to get an opportunity to ask questions. And it was a very lively discussion. Every single one of the Democratic candidates, the Republicans refused to come. Every single one of the Democratic candidates addressed the key issues that were raised by these workers at this conference. And I said at the beginning of the forum, when I introduced them, that every single one of them has the competency to be an outstanding president of the United States, unlike the present occupant of the White House. I believe that whoever's going to run for office in whichever party, that they have to pay more attention to the issues of working families, and they have to realize that legislation that's important to workers is something that workers are going to be more active and more outspoken on. When the administration tried to move towards privatizing Social Security, it was amazing the number of people all across this country who started taking a more active role and who started expressing their views to their members of Congress, and Congress listened to them, thank God. But it's important that average people be involved in politics at the local level. Tip O'Neill always used to say that politics is local, and he was so right, because there is more, we see more and more can be done at the local level, in communities, in states, and that's why those offices are important, as well as the congressional office. We saw in the congressional campaign last November the greatest outpouring of workers to go and ring doorbells and to run phone banks and things like that. By a couple of days before election, we had 250,000 workers who were involved in every congressional district all around the country. Well, as a part of this program that we have this year to focus on health care, we will enlist, our goal is to enlist 1 million activists in every state to work on championing the need for health care reform, and not 10 years from now, but in 2009, when we hope that we'll have a president who will sign that kind of a bill.
Joyce?
My wife is a member of UFT also.
Do you right?
I'm Joyce Elliott. Not many of us in Arkansas AFT members, American Federation of Teachers, but I am one of them. And welcome to Arkansas. And I also was proud to serve in the Arkansas legislature to take some of the union issues there and hope to get back there as well. My question to you, though, is in your talk, you alluded to how business, labor, and management must work together, and that is what the AFL-CIO wants to do. But so many times we get people believe in the mythology that unions are agents of conflict rather than agents of resolution. Could you give us some notions of how the three parties working together that you mentioned, how that's manifested itself, and how you see that helping us out in the future to achieve all the things that you mentioned?
Thank you. It's most important. The question is great. I firmly believe that unless we have a greater spirit of working together between labor, management, and government, we're not going to be able to solve these problems. Having been around as long as I have been around, I have had the experience of working at times when we had good labor management policies in our country and in many of our states. And I think that it's the secret to achieving, just not to overdo the health care issue, but just on that issue alone. When I said that it's unfair for employers who provide good health care to be knocked out because of the competition from traders in other parts of the world, and because of our health care costs, that they are not able to compete. Those employers are good employers. They deserve some consideration. If we were to address the national health care issue, we would have a more cost-effective program. It would reduce the costs of health care, and it would provide a quality program. Every other industrialized country in the world can do it, and they're doing it together, labor, management, and business. We have seen the worst track record on labor and management and business and government cooperation in the past two terms of President Bush's administration. Labor management programs exist in many industries where they come together, especially in the industrial sector. They talk about issues unrelated directly to the collective bargaining, but they'll talk about training and education in the workplace. They'll talk about safety. They'll talk about how they can work together in addressing a major problem that might be occurring in that industry, how there may be a major problem on competitiveness. In the public sector, there are some very good, successful labor management programs in different states and different cities, but this should be a national policy. It should be encouraged, as it has been in former presidential administrations, where there was funding provided for, and we're talking about seed money, to get these groups started. It's better for our country, it's better for our economy, and it's better for workers. Thank you.
Bob?
Thank you. My name is José Guzardi. I'm a student at the Clinton School. I'm from Brazil originally. And there are several international students here in the Clinton School. And as future leaders in our countries, I'd like to ask you, what would you suggest us as future leaders in our countries do to level the field of our workers to the American workers and at the same time compete in the global economy? Thank you.
Would you repeat the last part? What?
Sure. What can we realistically do abroad to level the field of our workers and at the same time having our economies competing in the global markets?
There are so many different ways in which those issues can be addressed. We, the American labor movement, have a very good relationship with workers all around the world. And as the Dean mentioned, I chair a group called the Trade Union Advisory Committee, which works with industrial nations. And my peers in those countries are people that I meet with and discuss common issues that we have. But if you take a look at our trade policy as an example, when we are opposed to a trade agreement, it's not because we want to impose on another nation our standards or our conditions. What we're asking for is that another nation allow their workers freedom of association, freedom to bargain collectively, attempt to abolish child labor and forced labor. We're not imposing on them what level their minimum wage should be or any of those kinds of issues. But we are looking for their ability to have more democracy and to address their human rights issues in those countries. And I think that we have an obligation. There have been several situations over the past couple of years where trade ministers or government representatives from some of the Latin American countries and South American, but I guess also Africa and Asia, who have come to us and told us that, encouraged us to support passage of a bill in Congress regarding their bilateral trade agreement. And when we asked them about what are they doing to change their labor law to protect the rights of workers, and we're talking about rights that the United Nations, that the ILO have really promulgated, and the ministers have told us that that they're willing to make those changes, but that our trade administration refuses to let them make those changes. We know for a fact that they have in at least 5 or 6 major countries in South America. I don't think Brazil was one of them. I don't think President Lula would let them do it. But I know with Chile and Peru and Panama that the American trade ambassador discouraged any of these countries from changing their laws or updating their standards in terms of rights of workers and addressing human rights questions. those are the kinds of ways that we attempt to improve the lives of workers in other countries. Just as a sideline, we have a very strong international affairs program, and some of the money to fund that program has come from the United States government, but it's a program to build democracy in the developing world and to also work on human rights issues. And we have operations in 27 different countries, staffed mostly by citizens of those countries, but who are active in promoting democracy and human rights. And so we're striving in every way we can to improve the lives of our trading partners as well as our own workers.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for your visit, President. About a year or so ago, there was a report from the World Trade Organization, and you spoke about globalization earlier. Apparently, the World Trade Organization can override our own system of laws here, and I'm referring to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We had a case where meat was packed overseas, and a USDA sticker was applied to it and shipped here. What we found out, where it was packed, the companies were hiring the meat inspectors, whereas in the United States, that's not the case. How can you help protect the American people from these potential dangers in light of what has recently happened from China?
And what is the question?
The question is, can the unions take a more active role for those members who are meat packers to bring forth to the American people and to their elected officials the need for imposing the higher standards of the USDA over any authority that the World Trade Organization can assert over it?
And we do take a strong stand, not just with the union that represents the meat packers, but as a part of our own national public policy, which includes all the unions of the AFL-CIO. And that's an issue that has become more serious, as you have referred to it, more recently, or at least we've become more aware, and we have to really be more outspoken on it, and we have to look for legislative changes. But we also have to face up to the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization has rules, and I referred to it in my remarks. Sometimes those rules have to be changed. And if there's not enough enforcement power, then they should be given the enforcement power to correct situations like this. And we see it with our overall position on trade policy, where the WTO could be writing rules that are more supportive of the issues that workers have with our trading partners all around the world. President Clinton, when the World Trade Organization met in Seattle in, I forget which year, but it was close to the end of his term, he flew out to Seattle to address the World Trade Organization and to talk about some of these issues and to try to get them to change some of their rules. He was successful in raising the attention on these issues, but they were not about to change, and they're controlled. Every country has one vote. They're controlled by the countries, in particular the countries of the developing world, which do not want to change these rules, and because of what effect it might have on their own economy. But the president was a big supporter for that change, and we commended him for that. But you're right, we have to do a better job at this.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for John Sweeney.